The hum of the airplane cabin was drowned out by the rush of passengers finding their seats, overhead compartments clicking shut, and the muffled voices of flight attendants going through their pre-flight routines. Among them, Margaret, a silver-haired woman in her late 70s, moved with a quiet grace. She was dressed in a simple, worn cardigan, accompanied by her constant companion, a large, weathered golden retriever named Max. The pair made their way to the front of the plane, where Margaret presented her first-class ticket to the flight attendant. As she settled into her seat, Margaret couldn't help but notice the glances from some of the other passengers. Some smiled warmly, recognizing the comfort her dog brought her, but others seemed less understanding. Her dog, Max, was a rescue dog trained to assist her with daily activities, a necessity due to her age and the lingering effects of an old injury. Margaret was just about to relax when a deep, irritated voice broke through the ambient noise. "This is ridiculous. Who allowed this?" The voice belonged to Michael Sullivan, a sharply dressed man in his early 50s, his face a mask of disbelief and disdain. He stood in the aisle, glaring at Margaret and Max as if they were an offense to his very presence. "I'm not sitting next to a dog in first class. This is supposed to be a premium experience." The flight attendant, a young woman trying to maintain her professionalism, approached cautiously. "Sir, the dog is a service animal, and Mrs. O'Connor has every right to be here." Michael's jaw tightened. "I don't care what rights she has. This is first class, not a kennel. I paid for comfort, not to sit next to an animal that smells like it just came from a farm." Margaret, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "Max is cleaner and better-mannered than most people I've encountered in my life, young man. But if you're so disturbed, I'm sure there are other seats available, perhaps in coach." The suggestion hit Michael like a slap. His eyes narrowed, and he opened his mouth to retort, but the flight attendant intervened. "Sir, please take your seat. We're about to take off. If there's a problem, we can address it once we're in the air." With a final glare at Margaret, Michael huffed and took his seat beside her, his body stiff with indignation. Margaret, meanwhile, simply turned her attention to Max, stroking his fur gently as she whispered reassurances to him. Despite the tension, Max remained perfectly calm, his eyes fixed on Margaret with unwavering loyalty. As the plane taxied down the runway, the air between Margaret and Michael was thick with unspoken words and mutual dislike. Neither could have anticipated how drastically their fates would soon intertwine, nor how the journey ahead would strip away the facades they both wore. The plane began its ascent, leaving the ground far behind. Margaret closed her eyes, seeking a moment of peace, while Michael fidgeted beside her, still seething. It was just another flight for most passengers, but for Margaret and Michael, it was the beginning of an unexpected ordeal that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. The plane had been airborne for about an hour when the tension between Margaret and Michael became palpable to those around them. Michael had spent most of the time shifting in his seat, sighing loudly and occasionally shooting venomous looks in Margaret's direction. His irritation seemed to have no end, and it wasn't long before he finally spoke up again. "This is absolutely intolerable," Michael muttered, more to himself than to anyone else, though loud enough for Margaret to hear. How did they allow this in first class? Margaret didn't open her eyes. She kept her hand on Max's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, grounding herself in the comfort of his presence. But Michael's incessant grumbling was hard to ignore. With a calm, measured voice, she finally addressed him without looking his way. "Mr. Sullivan, is it? Perhaps you should focus on something else. I'm sure your phone has plenty of distractions to keep you occupied." Michael bristled at her tone. "You think I'm just some entitled businessman, don't you? Some guy who has nothing better to do than complain?" Margaret opened her eyes and turned to him, her expression composed. "I think you're someone who's used to getting his way, no matter what it costs others." Her words hit closer to home than Michael expected. He stared at her, trying to read the calm in her eyes, but all he saw was an unwavering strength that unnerved him. Before he could respond, the flight attendant returned, carrying a tray of drinks. "Would you care for a drink, sir?" she asked, her smile professional, but tinged with a hint of unease, as if sensing the tension. Michael waved her away dismissively. "Just bring me something strong." The flight attendant quickly complied, setting a glass of whiskey on his tray table. Michael grabbed the glass and downed it in one go, trying to quell the irritation boiling inside him. He was a man who thrived on control, and the fact that this elderly woman seemed unfazed by his attempts to intimidate her only fueled his frustration. Meanwhile, Margaret accepted a glass of water from the attendant, her hand steady as she took a sip. She could feel Michael's eyes on her, burning with unspoken judgment. But she had dealt with men like him before. Men who mistook kindness for weakness, who believed that power and wealth were the only currencies of worth. As the flight continued, the cabin lights dimmed, signaling the beginning of the in-flight meal service. The scent of food filled the air, but even that wasn't enough to soften the sharp edges between Margaret and Michael. Just as the flight attendants began distributing the meals, the plane suddenly shuddered. The lights flickered, and there was a collective gasp from the passengers. Margaret's hand instinctively tightened on Max's fur, while Michael's knuckles turned white as he gripped the armrests. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, his tone calm but urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The turbulence grew worse, the plane rocking more violently as it hit pockets of unstable air. Michael's bravado melted away, replaced by a flash of fear that he couldn't hide. He glanced at Margaret, who had her eyes closed again, her lips moving in what looked like a silent prayer. For the first time, Michael felt a pang of uncertainty. The situation was quickly spiraling out of control, and despite his wealth and influence, there was nothing he could do to change it. The realization hit him hard, chipping away at the arrogance he had so carefully constructed over the years. Beside him, Margaret remained composed, her calmness in the face of danger a stark contrast to Michael's rising panic. It wasn't just the turbulence that was shaking him. It was the unsettling feeling that perhaps, for the first time in his life, he was truly powerless. As the plane continued to shake, the flight attendants struggled to maintain their balance, rushing to secure the carts and assist passengers. The once serene atmosphere of the first-class cabin had devolved into a tense, fearful silence, broken only by the occasional cry of alarm. Michael turned to Margaret, his voice trembling slightly. "Aren't you afraid? This could be it." Margaret opened her eyes and looked at him, her gaze steady. "Fear is natural, Mr. Sullivan, but it doesn't help in moments like these. All we can do is stay calm and trust that we'll get through it." Michael stared at her, trying to find some of that calm within himself, but it eluded him. The plane dipped suddenly, and a tray slid off a nearby table, crashing to the floor. The sound was a jarring reminder of how precarious their situation had become. Margaret tightened her grip on Max, who remained alert but calm, as if sensing that his presence was needed more than ever. She knew this wasn't just turbulence. Something was seriously wrong. But panicking wouldn't help anyone, least of all the man beside her who seemed on the verge of losing it. The intercom crackled again, but this time, there was an edge of tension in the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, please prepare for an emergency landing." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Margaret's heart skipped a beat, but she remained outwardly calm. Michael, on the other hand, felt his world spinning out of control. This was not how things were supposed to go. He was supposed to be invincible, untouchable. But now, as the reality of their situation sank in, Michael realized that he was facing something far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. And the only person who seemed unfazed by it all was the elderly woman he had dismissed as insignificant. As the plane began its descent, the cabin was filled with a tense silence. Margaret looked out the window, the ground growing closer with alarming speed. She could feel Michael's eyes on her, searching for some sign of fear, but all he found was a calm resolve that both bewildered and humbled him. The situation was about to get far worse, and neither of them knew it yet. But in that moment, as the plane descended toward an unknown fate, Michael Sullivan found himself clinging to the hope that somehow, this woman beside him could guide them through whatever lay ahead. The plane plummeted through the clouds, the engines roaring as the descent accelerated. Overhead compartments rattled violently, and the once orderly cabin descended into chaos. Passengers gripped their armrests with white-knuckled fear, murmuring prayers or stifling cries. The flight attendants, their faces pale, moved quickly to secure themselves, their usual calm shattered by the unfolding crisis. Michael's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of how little control he had in this moment. He glanced at Margaret, who was still seated beside him, her eyes focused and unwavering. Despite the mounting panic in the cabin, she remained remarkably calm, her hand never leaving Max's back as the loyal dog leaned against her, sensing the gravity of the situation. "Why aren't you afraid?" Michael finally blurted out, his voice strained with tension. Margaret turned her gaze to him, her expression one of quiet resolve. "It's not about not being afraid, Mr. Sullivan. It's about knowing that fear won't help us. Right now, we need to stay focused." Michael swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. He had always prided himself on being a man of action, someone who could control any situation. But here, at 30,000 feet, hurtling toward an emergency landing, he realized that control was an illusion. He was completely at the mercy of forces far beyond his influence. The plane shuddered again, and Michael instinctively reached for the armrest, his hand brushing against Margaret's. He quickly pulled away, as if the brief contact had shocked him. Margaret, however, didn't react, her attention still fixed on the situation at hand. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom once more, cutting through the tension with an urgent message. "Brace for impact. Brace, brace, brace." Panic erupted in the cabin. Passengers scrambled to adopt the brace position, their movements frantic. Michael followed suit, his body trembling as he bent forward, his hands gripping the back of his head. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never experienced before. This wasn't just turbulence. This was life or death. Margaret, too, braced herself, her body curled protectively around Max. Her mind raced, but not with fear, with determination. She had survived far worse in her life, and she wasn't about to let this be her end. She whispered a few soothing words to Max, who remained steadfast by her side, his presence a source of comfort in the maelstrom around them. The plane descended rapidly, the ground rushing up to meet them. The noise was deafening, metal groaning, engines roaring, and the desperate cries of passengers mixing into a cacophony of terror. Michael squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable, his mind flashing through memories of a life spent in pursuit of wealth and power. Then, with a bone-jarring thud, the plane hit the ground. The impact was violent, throwing everyone forward as the aircraft skidded across the rough terrain. Overhead bins burst open, showering the cabin with bags and debris. The sounds of scraping metal and shattering glass filled the air, drowning out even the screams of the passengers. Margaret felt the jolt of the impact reverberate through her entire body, but she held on, instinctively protecting Max as they were tossed about. The world outside the windows blurred into a streak of colors and shadows as the plane careened across the earth, every second an agonizing eternity. Finally, after what felt like an age, the plane ground to a halt. For a moment, there was only silence, the world holding its breath as if unsure of what had just happened. Then, slowly, the sounds of groans, sobs, and muffled cries began to fill the cabin. The smell of smoke and fuel permeated the air, a stark reminder of the danger that still loomed. Michael lifted his head, his vision swimming as he tried to make sense of what had just occurred. His body ached from the force of the landing, and he could taste blood in his mouth where he had bitten his lip. But he was alive. They were all alive. He turned to Margaret, who was already sitting up, her hands still resting on Max's back. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear and focused, scanning the cabin for any signs of immediate danger. "Are you okay?" Michael asked, his voice hoarse. Margaret nodded slightly, her attention still on Max, who was licking her hand, sensing her concern. "We need to get out of here," she said, her tone firm. "There's no telling what could happen next." The realization hit Michael like a cold splash of water. The danger wasn't over, far from it. The plane was down, but they were still in the middle of nowhere, and the threat of fire or explosion was very real. He unbuckled his seatbelt with shaky hands, his mind racing as he tried to think of what to do next. For once, He didn't have all the answers. He glanced at Margaret, who was already moving, her actions deliberate and efficient. "We need to stay calm and help each other," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Panic will only make things worse." Michael found himself nodding, despite the fear still gnawing at him. There was something in Margaret's voice that commanded respect, something that made him want to listen, to follow her lead. As they prepared to evacuate the plane, Michael's mind buzzed with a mix of emotions: fear, confusion, and a growing sense of something unfamiliar: humility. For the first time, he realized that he wasn't the one in control. It was Margaret, this elderly woman he had dismissed as irrelevant, who was taking charge. And for the first time in his life, Michael Sullivan wasn't sure if he was capable of saving himself. He would need Margaret's help to survive this, and that was a truth that shook him to his core. The emergency exits were opening, and passengers were beginning to move, their faces etched with fear and desperation. The cold air outside rushed into the cabin, carrying with it the scent of dirt and greenery, a stark contrast to the sterile environment they had left behind. As Michael followed Margaret toward the exit, he couldn't help but wonder how he had ended up here, in this moment, where nothing he had ever learned or accomplished mattered. The world outside was vast and unforgiving, and it was only just beginning to reveal its challenges. But Michael knew one thing: if he was going to survive, he needed to learn from Margaret. And as they stepped out into the unknown, he realized that this was just the beginning of a journey that would test every part of him he thought he understood. The biting cold hit them like a slap as Margaret, Michael, and the other passengers stepped out of the wreckage and into the harsh reality of their situation. The plane had landed in a desolate, snow-covered wilderness. The landscape was vast and unforgiving, stretching out in every direction with no sign of civilization. Michael shivered involuntarily, his designer suit and thin overcoat doing little to protect him from the icy wind. He looked around, his breath visible in the frigid air, as the enormity of their predicament settled over him like a heavy weight. Margaret, on the other hand, seemed far more composed. Her focus remained on Max, who trotted beside her, his fur ruffled by the wind, but his demeanor calm and alert. She surveyed the area quickly, taking in the details that Michael was too shell-shocked to notice. The passengers, now huddled together in a loose group, were murmuring anxiously, their breath forming small clouds as they spoke. The fear and confusion were palpable, and the shock of the crash was still fresh in everyone's minds. A few of the flight attendants were attempting to maintain order, but their voices trembled with the cold and the gravity of the situation. "Is there any word from the cockpit?" a man asked, his voice shaking. "Are they sending help?" A flight attendant shook her head, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "We've made contact, but it could be hours before they reach us. Maybe longer in this weather." The news sent a ripple of dread through the group. Hours, maybe longer, was a terrifying prospect in these conditions. Michael, who had always been used to immediate solutions and instant gratification, felt a pang of despair. He had no idea how to survive out here, and the realization made him feel utterly helpless. Margaret noticed his unease. "We can't just stand here waiting," she said, her tone brisk. "We need to focus on survival, staying warm, finding shelter, and making sure everyone stays calm." Michael stared at her, still grappling with the reality of their situation. "But what do we do? We're in the middle of nowhere." Margaret didn't hesitate. "First, we need to gather everyone who's injured and make sure they're stable. Then we look for any supplies from the wreckage, blankets, first aid kits, anything that can help us stay warm and safe." Her matter-of-fact approach was a stark contrast to the panic setting in among the other passengers. It was as if she had been preparing for this moment her whole life, and that confidence was beginning to have a calming effect on those around her. Michael, however, was struggling to process it all. "You sound like you've done this before," he said, a mix of skepticism and reluctant admiration in his voice. Margaret met his gaze, her expression serious. "I've spent a lot of time helping others in difficult situations. You learn quickly what's important when survival is on the line." There was something in her tone that suggested there was far more to Margaret than met the eye, but Michael didn't have time to dwell on it. The wind was picking up, and the cold was seeping into his bones. He had to focus on the here and now, and that meant listening to Margaret. The group began to move as Margaret took charge, directing people to check the wreckage for supplies while others tended to the injured. Michael found himself following her lead, even though every instinct told him he should be the one in control. But out here, in this frozen wasteland, his instincts were worthless. Margaret was the one who knew what to do, and that meant swallowing his pride and admitting that he needed her help. As they worked, Michael couldn't help but notice the way Margaret moved through the tasks with a quiet efficiency. She didn't hesitate or second-guess herself. She simply did what needed to be done, and the others responded to her authority without question. After a short time, they managed to gather a small pile of supplies: blankets, first aid kits, bottled water, and a few small snacks that had survived the crash. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in this environment, something was better than nothing. Margaret turned to the group, her breath misting in the cold air. "We need to find shelter," she said. "The plane is too exposed, and we need to conserve body heat. There might be a tree line or some natural cover nearby." Michael looked out at the vast expanse of white, his heart sinking at the thought of venturing further into the unknown. "And if we can't find anything, then we'll have to improvise," Margaret replied. "But standing still isn't an option. We need to keep moving, or we'll freeze out here." The reality of their situation hit Michael like a punch to the gut. This wasn't some minor inconvenience. This was a matter of life and death. And the only thing standing between them and disaster was an elderly woman with more resilience than he'd ever encountered. As the group began to move, led by Margaret and Max, Michael fell in line behind them. The cold bit into his skin, and his mind raced with doubts and fears. But there was also a flicker of something else: respect. Margaret had taken charge when no one else could, and despite his initial disdain, Michael couldn't help but admire her strength. The snow crunched beneath their feet as they trudged forward, the wind howling around them. It was a harsh and unforgiving environment, and every step felt like a battle against the elements. But as they moved further from the wreckage, something began to shift in Michael's perspective. This was not his world. He was no longer the powerful executive who could bend others to his will. Out here, in the wilderness, he was just another person fighting to survive. And for the first time, he found himself relying on someone else's strength instead of his own. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the cold seeping deeper into their bodies with every passing minute. But Margaret didn't waver. She pushed forward with a determination that seemed unshakable, and the others followed, drawn by her quiet confidence. Finally, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow, Margaret spotted something in the distance. A small outcropping of rocks, partially obscured by snow but offering some measure of protection from the wind. "There," she said, pointing ahead. "We can take shelter there for the night." Relief washed over the group as they picked up the pace, the promise of even a little cover giving them a renewed sense of hope. Michael stumbled slightly, his legs numb from the cold, but he kept moving, driven by the same will to survive that Margaret had instilled in him. As they reached the rocks, the group huddled together, sharing the few blankets they had managed to salvage. The cold was still brutal, but at least they were out of the wind, and that small comfort was enough to keep them going. Margaret settled herself beside Max, who curled up beside her, providing warmth and comfort in the freezing night. She looked around at the group, her expression softening slightly as she saw the way they were all looking to her for guidance. Michael, sitting nearby and shivering under a thin blanket, caught her eye. There was a moment of unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of the shift in their dynamic. He had started this journey with contempt for the woman beside him, but now, as the night closed in around them, he realized that Margaret was the key to their survival. The group fell silent as darkness settled over the landscape, the temperature dropping even further. But despite the fear and uncertainty that hung in the air, there was also a flicker of hope, a hope that, with Margaret's guidance, they might just make it through the night. As Michael huddled in the cold, his breath visible in the night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything he had ever known was being rewritten. Margaret, this woman he had dismissed as irrelevant, was proving to be the one thing standing between them and death. And as he closed his eyes, trying to conserve what little warmth he had left, He realized that he was no longer the man he had been when he boarded that plane. Out here, in the wilderness, Margaret was leading them all into the unknown. And for once, Michael was content to follow. Enjoying the video? Subscribe to our channel to receive more interesting content. Click the subscribe button and stay updated with the latest news. The night was merciless. Cold winds howled through the rocky outcropping, slicing through the thin blankets and layers of clothing, stealing warmth from the huddled survivors. Sleep was a fleeting visitor, interrupted by the sharp bite of the freezing air and the gnawing fear that gripped each person in the group. Michael lay awake, his body trembling from the cold and his mind churning with thoughts he couldn't quiet. He glanced over at Margaret, who was sitting upright, Max's head resting in her lap. Despite the harsh conditions, she maintained a sense of calm that both baffled and impressed Michael. How could she be so composed when everything around them screamed of danger and uncertainty? As if sensing his gaze, Margaret looked over at him, her eyes soft in the dim light of the moon. She gave him a small, reassuring smile, a gesture that seemed almost out of place in their dire situation. But it was enough to momentarily ease the tension in Michael's chest. "You should try to get some rest," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold night. "Tomorrow will be difficult, and you'll need your strength." Michael shook his head slightly. "I can't sleep. Not with all this." He gestured vaguely at their surroundings, the words he wanted to say, about the fear, the helplessness, catching in his throat. Margaret nodded, understanding more than he could express. "It's hard to find peace in a place like this," she said softly, "but we have to take things one step at a time. Focus on what we can control and let the rest go." Michael exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the frigid air. "How do you do it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you stay so calm?" Margaret looked down at Max, her hand gently stroking his fur. "You learn a lot when you've been through difficult times," she said, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "You realize that panic only makes things worse. It blinds you to the solutions that are right in front of you." Michael watched her, intrigued by the layers of strength she seemed to carry so effortlessly. "What have you been through?" he asked, his curiosity piqued by the hint of a past she rarely revealed. Margaret hesitated for a moment, as if considering how much to share. But then she met Michael's gaze, and something in his eyes, perhaps the vulnerability she hadn't seen before, prompted her to speak. "I've spent most of my life helping others," Margaret began, her voice steady but tinged with a hint of nostalgia. "It started when I was young, volunteering at local shelters, working with animals and people who had nowhere else to turn. Over the years, it became more than just a calling. It became my life's work." She paused, her eyes distant as memories flooded back. "There were times when it was difficult, when I faced situations that seemed impossible to overcome. But I always believed that if you stayed calm and kept your focus, you could find a way through. It's something Max and I have done more times than I can count." Michael listened intently, the pieces of Margaret's life beginning to form a picture in his mind. "So that's why you're so good at this," he said, a note of admiration in his voice. "You've been preparing for it your whole life?" Margaret smiled faintly, but there was a sadness behind it. "I wouldn't say I'm good at it, but I've learned to do what needs to be done. When you're faced with life and death situations, you can't afford to hesitate. People and animals depend on you." Her words hung in the cold night air, resonating with Michael in a way he hadn't expected. For so long, he had measured success by the deals he closed, the wealth he accumulated, the power he wielded. But here, in the middle of a frozen wilderness, all of that seemed trivial compared to the quiet strength of the woman beside him. As he processed everything she had said, Michael felt a shift within himself, a loosening of the arrogance and self-importance that had defined him for so long. He realized that in this situation, none of the things that had once given him confidence mattered. The only thing that mattered was survival, and Margaret had proven herself to be the one person capable of leading them through it. Just as Michael was about to speak, a soft groan came from nearby. One of the passengers, a middle-aged woman who had been injured during the crash, was stirring, her face contorted with pain. Margaret immediately moved to her side, her movements swift and purposeful. "Sure, it's okay," Margaret whispered soothingly as she knelt beside the woman. "You're safe. Just try to relax." The woman's breathing was labored, her pain evident in every shallow breath she took. Michael watched as Margaret gently assessed the woman's injuries, her hands steady despite the freezing temperatures. It was clear that Margaret had experience in dealing with these situations, and Michael couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for ever doubting her. "She's hurt pretty badly," Margaret said quietly, looking up at Michael. "We need to keep her warm and make sure she stays hydrated. But without proper medical supplies, there's only so much we can do." Michael nodded, the gravity of their situation pressing down on him once more. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Margaret met his gaze, her eyes searching his face for a moment before she nodded. "Yes, we need to keep everyone's spirits up, keep them focused on survival. You can help with that. People look up to you. You have a presence that commands attention. Use it to keep them calm." Michael was taken aback by her words. It was the first time anyone had ever asked him to use his influence for something other than business. The idea of leading people through a crisis was foreign to him, and yet, he felt a strange sense of purpose beginning to take root. "I'll do what I can," Michael said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty he felt. It was a promise, not just to Margaret, but to himself, a commitment to rise to the challenge before him. As the night wore on, Michael found himself following Margaret's lead, assisting where he could, offering words of encouragement to those who needed it. It was an unfamiliar role, but as the hours passed, he began to see the impact of his efforts. People responded to him, their fear easing slightly as they saw him working alongside them, sharing in their struggle. The cold remained relentless, and the night felt endless, but there was a growing sense of unity among the group, a bond forged in the face of adversity. And in the midst of it all, Michael began to see Margaret not just as the elderly woman he had initially dismissed, but as a source of inspiration, a beacon of hope in the darkness. As dawn approached, the first light of day casting a pale glow over the snowy landscape, Michael felt a sense of determination he hadn't known in years. They had made it through the night, and though the road ahead was still fraught with danger, he knew they had a fighting chance. And as he looked over at Margaret, who was tending to Max with the same care and devotion she had shown everyone else, Michael realized that he had been wrong about so much, about Margaret, about himself, about what truly mattered. For the first time in a long while, Michael Sullivan felt the stirrings of something deeper than success or power. He felt the beginnings of a transformation, one that he couldn't fully understand yet, but knew was inevitable. The challenges ahead would test them all, but Michael was no longer afraid. He had found a strength within himself that he never knew existed, and he knew that with Margaret by his side, they would find a way to survive. The new day had begun, and with it, a new Michael Sullivan. A man ready to face the unknown, not with arrogance or fear, but with humility and resolve. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a faint, silvery glow on the snow-covered landscape. The group, huddled together for warmth, began to stir as the new day signaled the beginning of their struggle for survival. The cold was still biting, but the sight of daylight brought a small measure of relief to the weary survivors. Margaret was the first to rise, gently coaxing Max to his feet. The golden retriever stretched, shaking off the snow that had gathered on his fur during the night. Margaret patted his head, offering him a reassuring smile before turning to the others. "Everyone, we need to start moving," she called out, her voice steady but urgent. "The cold will only get worse if we stay here, and we need to find better shelter and food." The group slowly began to rouse, groaning as they stretched stiff limbs and tried to shake off the cold that had settled into their bones. Michael was among the last to stand, his body aching from the night spent on the frozen ground. But despite the discomfort, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret moved through the group, checking on each person, making sure they were able to continue. The injured woman from the night before was still weak, her face pale, but she managed a grateful nod when Margaret offered her a hand to help her stand. Michael watched as Margaret worked, her presence a calming force amid the uncertainty. He had spent the night reflecting on his own limitations, and now, as he prepared to face the challenges ahead, He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the woman who had taken charge when no one else could. "We need to head east," Margaret said, pointing to the direction where the sun was rising. "There might be a forest or some natural cover that way. We'll have a better chance of finding shelter and resources there." Michael nodded, stepping forward to stand beside her. "I'll help lead," he said, his voice carrying a new resolve. "We'll get through this together." Margaret looked at him, her eyes reflecting a quiet approval. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Your help will make a difference." With that, the group began to move, their footsteps crunching in the snow as they set off in the direction Margaret had indicated. The cold was unforgiving, but the movement helped to keep their bodies warm, and the sense of purpose gave them the strength to keep going. As they walked, Michael found himself moving closer to Margaret, drawn to her calm and steady presence. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them was comfortable, a shared understanding that words weren't necessary. The terrain was rough, the snow deep in places, making every step a challenge. But Margaret kept a steady pace, Max trotting beside her, his keen senses on high alert. Michael, too, found himself more aware of his surroundings, the adrenaline of survival sharpening his focus. After what felt like hours, the group crested a small hill and spotted a line of trees in the distance, a forest that promised some measure of protection from the elements. A murmur of relief spread through the group as they saw the potential for shelter, and their pace quickened as they made their way toward the tree line. But as they approached the forest, Margaret suddenly stopped, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the area. Michael followed her gaze, trying to see what had caught her attention. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She scanned the trees, her expression tense. "We're not alone," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Margaret pointed toward the edge of the forest, where the snow had been disturbed in a way that suggested recent movement. "Tracks," she said. "Someone, or something, was here recently." Michael's mind raced. They had assumed they were alone out here, but the discovery of tracks changed everything. Were they being watched? Was there another group of survivors? Or was there something more dangerous lurking in the woods? "Should we keep going?" Michael asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. Margaret hesitated, weighing the risks. "We don't have a choice," she said after a moment. "We need shelter, and this forest is our best option. But we need to be cautious." The group, sensing the tension, followed Margaret's lead as they carefully approached the forest. The trees offered some protection from the wind, but the air was still heavy with the weight of the unknown. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves set nerves on edge, and Michael found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once, his senses heightened by the potential danger. As they moved deeper into the woods, Margaret motioned for the group to spread out slightly, keeping their eyes open for anything unusual. The silence was oppressive, the only sound the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig. Suddenly, Max stiffened, his ears pricking up as he growled low in his throat. Margaret stopped immediately, holding up a hand to signal the group to halt. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the trees, searching for the source of Max's alarm. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Michael saw it, a figure moving between the trees, barely visible in the shadows. His breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped into view, revealing a man, dressed in tattered clothing and carrying a makeshift weapon. The man's eyes were wild, his face gaunt with hunger and desperation. He looked at the group with a mix of suspicion and fear, his grip tightening on the crude weapon in his hand. For a moment, no one moved. The tension was electric, the air thick with the possibility of violence. Michael could feel the fear radiating from the group, their breaths shallow as they waited to see what would happen next. But Margaret, ever calm, took a step forward, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "We don't mean you any harm," she said, her voice steady. "We're survivors, just like you." The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Margaret and the others. "Survivors?" he repeated, his voice rough and cracked. Margaret nodded. "Yes, we crashed nearby, and we're looking for shelter. We don't have much, but we can share what we have." The man's grip on the weapon loosened slightly, though the wariness in his eyes remained. "I've been out here for days," he said, his voice laced with exhaustion. "No food, no water. Thought I was the last one." Michael took a cautious step forward, sensing the man's desperation. "We're not here to hurt you," he said, trying to project the calm that Margaret had shown. "We're just trying to survive." The man looked at them, his eyes scanning the group, taking in their weary faces and the meager supplies they carried. Finally, he lowered the weapon, though he didn't let go of it entirely. "If you've got food, I'll take it," he said, his voice still guarded. "But don't try anything. I'm not afraid to use this." Margaret nodded slowly. "We'll share what we have," she said. "But we need to work together if we're going to make it out of here." The man didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be weighing his options, trying to decide if he could trust them. But in the end, the promise of food and the possibility of companionship won out. "All right," he said gruffly, "but I'm keeping this." He held up the weapon, making it clear that he wasn't letting his guard down completely. Margaret nodded in agreement. "That's fine. Let's just get out of the cold and figure out what to do next." With the tension slightly eased, the group moved forward into the forest, the man trailing behind them, his eyes still wary. Michael kept close to Margaret, his mind reeling from the encounter. The world beyond the crash site was proving to be even more dangerous than he had imagined, and he knew that their survival depended not just on their ability to find shelter, but on their ability to navigate the human dangers that came with it. As they pressed deeper into the woods, the reality of their situation became clearer with every step. This was no longer just about surviving the elements. It was about surviving each other. And Michael knew that if they were going to make it out of this alive, they would need every ounce of strength and wisdom that Margaret possessed. For now, he was content to follow her lead. But he also understood that the challenges ahead would require him to find his own inner strength, one that had been dormant for far too long. The unknown stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving. But Michael was no longer the man he had been when this journey began. He was ready to face whatever came next, with Margaret by his side and the determination to survive driving him forward. The forest seemed to close in around them as the group ventured deeper into the woods. The trees, bare and skeletal, stood like silent sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind. The air was thick with tension, and every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set nerves on edge. Michael felt the weight of the forest pressing down on him, the darkness between the trees like a reminder of how vulnerable they were. Their new companion, the gaunt man with the makeshift weapon, kept to the rear of the group, his eyes darting nervously between the trees and the people in front of him. He had introduced himself as John, though it was clear that he wasn't interested in small talk. His focus was survival, and his distrust of the group was evident in every cautious step he took. Margaret, ever the leader, had taken point, Max by her side as they scouted for a suitable place to stop and regroup. Michael walked a few paces behind her, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The forest offered some protection from the wind, but it also presented new dangers, dangers that Michael was acutely aware of, especially with John in their midst. The group's progress was slow, the cold sapping their strength and the snow making each step a struggle. But despite the hardship, there was a growing sense of determination among them, a shared understanding that they had no choice but to keep moving if they were to survive. Finally, after what felt like hours, Margaret signaled for the group to stop. They had reached a small clearing, partially sheltered by a rocky overhang that jutted out from the hillside. It wasn't much, but it offered some protection from the elements, and it was the best they could hope for in the circumstances. "This will have to do for now," Margaret said, her breath visible in the cold air. "We need to gather wood for a fire and set up a perimeter. We don't know what else might be out here." John, who had been lingering at the edge of the group, spoke up, his voice gruff. "A fire's risky. It'll draw attention." Margaret met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "We can't afford not to have one. We need warmth, and the smoke could help rescuers find us if they're searching from the air." John grunted in response, clearly not convinced, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he moved off to the side, keeping a watchful eye on the surrounding trees while the others began gathering what they could for the fire. Michael, eager to contribute, started collecting branches and fallen limbs, his breath coming in quick bursts as he worked. The physical exertion helped to take his mind off the cold, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by more than just John. As he worked, he noticed Margaret keeping a close eye on their new companion, her wariness barely concealed. It was clear she didn't fully trust John either, but she was too wise to let it show. She had taken the lead in this fragile alliance, but Michael knew that she was also preparing for the possibility that it could fall apart at any moment. With the firewood collected, the group set about building a small fire beneath the overhang. It took several attempts, their cold fingers fumbling with the matches and kindling, but finally, a small flame caught and began to grow. The sight of the fire brought a wave of relief, and the group huddled around it, soaking in the warmth as the flames crackled and popped. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of the fire and the occasional gust of wind. The group sat close together, their faces illuminated by the flickering light, the tension easing slightly as the warmth seeped into their bodies. Michael found himself sitting next to Margaret, her presence a steadying influence in the uncertainty. He watched her as she stared into the fire, her thoughts seemingly far away. He wanted to say something, to express his gratitude for everything she had done, but the words felt inadequate. Before he could speak, John cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the group. "So what's the plan?" he asked, his tone brusque. "We can't just sit here waiting to freeze to death." Margaret looked up, meeting his gaze. "We'll rest here for a while, but we need to keep moving. There's no guarantee that anyone knows where we are, and we can't rely on being rescued." John scoffed, his distrust evident. "And what if there's something out there waiting for us? You think we're just going to march through these woods and find a way out?" "We don't have a choice," Margaret replied, her voice calm but resolute. "We're in this together, and we need to work as a team if we're going to survive." John's eyes narrowed, his suspicion palpable. "I'm not interested in playing nice, lady. I'm interested in staying alive." Michael tensed, sensing the confrontation building. He could see the fear in John's eyes, the desperation that had driven him to survive alone for so long. But he also saw the danger in allowing that fear to take control. "None of us can do this alone," Michael said, his voice firm. "We need each other if we're going to make it. We might not like it, but that's the reality." John's gaze shifted to Michael, his expression hard. "Easy for you to say. You're used to having everything handed to you." Michael bristled at the accusation, but before he could respond, Margaret intervened. "We're all in the same situation now," she said, her tone brokering no argument. "Whatever differences we had before don't matter anymore. Survival is all that matters." The group fell silent, the tension simmering just beneath the surface. John didn't respond, but the look in his eyes made it clear that the fragile alliance was far from secure. Michael could feel the unease settling over the group, the uncertainty gnawing at the edges of their resolve. As the fire crackled, Margaret leaned closer to Michael, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "We need to be careful with him," she said, her eyes flicking briefly to John. "He's scared, and fear can make people do dangerous things." Michael nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. John was a wild card, and in the delicate balance of their survival, one wrong move could tip the scales into chaos. He knew they needed to tread carefully, to keep the group united despite the growing tensions. The hours passed slowly, the fire offering some comfort, but doing little to ease the weight of their predicament. As the day wore on, the group took turns resting, their bodies weary from the cold and the exertion of the journey. But sleep was elusive, their minds too consumed by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Eventually, the fire began to die down, the flames shrinking to glowing embers. The sun, hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. The temperature dropped further, and the chill in the air grew more pronounced. Margaret, sensing the need to keep the group moving, stood and began to gather the remaining supplies. "We need to keep going," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "We can't afford to stay here overnight. It's too exposed." The group stirred, the prospect of another trek through the freezing woods daunting but necessary. Michael, feeling the ache in his muscles from the cold and the hard ground, forced himself to his feet. He glanced at John, who was still sitting by the fire, his expression unreadable. "Are you coming?" Michael asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. John hesitated, his eyes flicking between Michael and the dwindling fire. For a moment, it seemed as though he might refuse, but then he stood, his posture tense. "Yeah, I'm coming." The group set off once more, their breath visible in the cold air as they trudged through the snow. The forest, once a place of relative safety, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and unseen threats. The sense of being watched had returned, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was following them. Margaret led the way, her eyes scanning the path ahead, while Max trotted beside her, his nose close to the ground as he sniffed the air. The dog's alertness was both reassuring and unsettling, a reminder that danger could be lurking just beyond the edge of the trees. The forest grew darker as the sun disappeared completely, and the group was forced to rely on the dim light of the moon filtering through the clouds. Every step felt precarious, the snow masking uneven ground and hidden obstacles. Just as the group was beginning to lose hope of finding another place to stop, Margaret spotted a faint glow through the trees, light, barely visible but unmistakable. She held up a hand, signaling for the group to stop. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing toward the light. Michael squinted, his heart leaping with the possibility of salvation. "Is that a fire?" Margaret nodded, her expression cautious. It could be other survivors, or it could be something else. John, who had been hanging back, stepped forward, his expression guarded. "We should check it out, but we need to be careful." Margaret agreed, and the group began to move cautiously toward the light, their steps careful and deliberate. The forest seemed to grow quieter as they approached, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the snow. As they drew closer, the light became clearer, definitely a fire, flickering in the distance. But there was no sign of who or what might be tending it. The group paused at the edge of a small clearing, the fire now fully visible, casting eerie shadows across the trees. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the clearing, his eyes searching for any sign of movement. But the fire burned alone, its warmth and light beckoning them forward. "Stay here," Margaret whispered to the group. "I'll go check it out." Michael immediately shook his head. "I'll go with you. We shouldn't split up." Margaret hesitated, but then she nodded, recognizing the truth in his words. Together, they moved cautiously into the clearing, their eyes fixed on the fire. As they approached, Michael's senses were on high alert, every sound magnified by the silence of the forest. The fire crackled softly, and the warmth was a welcome relief from the biting cold. But there was no sign of anyone around. Margaret reached the fire first, her eyes scanning the area with a practiced gaze. "No one's here," she said quietly, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Michael knelt beside the fire, holding his hands out to warm them. "Do you think someone started it and left?" Or, before he could finish his thought, a noise from the trees made them both freeze. It was a rustling sound, faint but unmistakable. Michael's heart leapt into his throat as he turned toward the source of the sound, his eyes wide with fear. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. Another survivor, stumbling forward with a look of sheer exhaustion on his face. He was young, probably in his early 20s, with a scruffy beard and clothes that were torn and dirty. "Please," the young man gasped, his voice hoarse. "Help me." Margaret was at his side in an instant, her hand on his arm to steady him. "It's okay," she said gently. "We're here to help." "What happened?" The young man collapsed to his knees, his strength failing him. "I've been out here 4 days," he panted. "I thought I was alone." Michael knelt beside him, his mind racing with questions. "Were you with a group? Are there others?" The young man shook his head weakly. "No, I was the only one left." Margaret exchanged a worried glance with Michael. "We need to get him to the fire," she said. "He's hypothermic." Together, they helped the young man to the fire, wrapping him in one of the blankets they had salvaged from the wreckage. The rest of the group approached cautiously, their eyes filled with concern as they watched the scene unfold. As the young man huddled close to the fire, trying to absorb its warmth, Michael couldn't help but wonder how long he had been out there, struggling to survive on his own. The thought of what he must have endured sent a shiver down Michael's spine. Margaret, ever practical, began to ask the young man questions, trying to piece together his story. But it was clear that he was too weak to give coherent answers, his body and mind both ravaged by the ordeal. John, who had been watching from a distance, finally spoke up. "We can't stay here," he said, his tone harsh. "If he's been out here for days, whatever got him could still be nearby." Margaret glanced at John, her expression hardening. "He's in no condition to move. We need to let him rest and warm up before we can think about moving again." John didn't seem convinced, but he didn't argue further. The group settled around the fire, the warmth a small comfort in the face of the unknown dangers that still lurked in the forest. As they waited, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that their fragile alliance was becoming more precarious by the moment. The arrival of the young man had added another layer of complexity to their situation, and the tension among the group was growing. Margaret, sensing the unease, leaned closer to Michael, her voice low. "We need to stay vigilant," she said. "There's more going on here than we realize." Michael nodded, the weight of her words pressing down on him. The forest, once a place of refuge, now felt like a trap, one that could close around them at any moment. As the night deepened, the fire crackled and popped, its light flickering against the trees. The group huddled close, their breaths visible in the cold air, their minds racing with thoughts of what might come next. And Michael, for all his newfound resolve, couldn't help but feel the fear creeping back in. The unknown stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving, and he knew that the journey ahead would test them all in ways they hadn't yet imagined. But as long as Margaret was by his side, he believed they might just have a chance to survive. The night was deepening, and the forest around them grew colder and darker. The fire crackled steadily, its warm glow a fragile beacon in the vast wilderness. The group had settled into an uneasy silence, the tension palpable as they huddled close to the flames. The young man they had found, still wrapped in a blanket, shivered as he sat near the fire, his body slowly absorbing the much-needed warmth. His breathing had steadied, but his eyes remained hollow, haunted by whatever he had endured. Michael watched him closely, trying to read the fear and exhaustion etched into the young man's face. There were so many questions he wanted to ask. How long had he been out here? What had he seen? But he knew now wasn't the time. The young man was barely holding on, and pushing him for answers might only push him further into shock. Margaret, ever perceptive, seemed to share Michael's concerns. She knelt beside the young man, her voice soft and soothing. "You're safe now," she reassured him. "We'll take care of you. Can you tell us your name?" The young man looked up at her, his eyes glazed with exhaustion. "Ethan," he whispered hoarsely. "My name is Ethan." Margaret nodded, offering him a small, encouraging smile. "It's good to meet you, Ethan. You're with friends now. We're going to get through this together." Ethan tried to smile back, but the effort seemed too much for him. He simply nodded, his gaze drifting back to the fire as if trying to lose himself in its warmth. John, who had been standing off to the side, finally stepped closer, his expression still wary. "How did you end up out here, Ethan?" he asked, his tone more demanding than concerned. Ethan flinched at the question, his body tensing as if bracing for a blow. Michael shot John a warning look, but Margaret spoke first, her tone firm. "He's been through enough, John. Let him rest." But John wasn't so easily dissuaded. "We need to know what we're dealing with," he insisted, his voice low but edged with impatience. "He might know something that could help us, or warn us." Ethan's eyes darted nervously between John and Margaret, his breathing quickening as if he were trapped between them. Michael felt a surge of protectiveness for the young man, his own fears momentarily forgotten as he saw the raw vulnerability in Ethan's face. "John's right," Michael said, carefully choosing his words to avoid escalating the tension. "But we need to give Ethan time. He's been through hell, and pushing him too hard won't help anyone." John's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned away, muttering something under his breath as he resumed his watch on the perimeter of their small camp. The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed with a faint, almost comforting sound. Margaret placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder, drawing his attention back to her. "Ethan, when you're ready, we'd like to hear what happened to you," she said gently. "But only when you're ready." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry and parched. He nodded, though it was clear he was still too shaken to speak. Margaret seemed to understand, and she let the matter drop, focusing instead on keeping him warm and calm. As the night wore on, the group settled into an uneasy rhythm. Margaret and Michael took turns tending to Ethan, offering him water and small bites of food to keep his strength up. Max remained close by, his presence a silent but steady comfort to everyone. John, ever the sentinel, kept his distance, his eyes scanning the darkened forest for any signs of danger. The cold was relentless, seeping into their bones despite the fire's warmth. Michael could feel the exhaustion pulling at him, the long hours of tension and fear taking their toll. But sleep was a luxury they couldn't afford, not with so much uncertainty hanging over them. At some point, as the fire burned low, Ethan began to speak. His voice was barely above a whisper, each word weighed down by the trauma of his ordeal. Margaret and Michael listened intently, their own fears momentarily set aside as they focused on the young man's story. "I was on my way to visit my parents," Ethan began, his voice trembling. "The plane. It wasn't supposed to crash. I don't even remember what happened. One moment we were in the air, and the next, we were falling." Michael felt a pang of sympathy as he recalled the terror of their own crash landing. It was a nightmare they all shared, a moment that had shattered their lives in an instant. "When I woke up, I was alone," Ethan continued, his eyes distant as he relived the memory. "The others, I don't know what happened to them. I tried to find them, but the cold made it so hard to think. I just kept walking, hoping I'd find someone. But..." He trailed off, his voice breaking. Margaret squeezed his hand gently, offering him silent support. "It's okay, Ethan," she said softly. "You don't have to explain everything right now." But Ethan seemed determined to continue. "I saw things out there," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Shadows, movements in the trees. I thought I was going crazy. Maybe I was. But it felt like something was watching me." A chill ran down Michael's spine, and he noticed Margaret's expression darken slightly. "What do you mean, something?" she asked carefully. Ethan shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know. I never saw it, but I felt it. It was like it was waiting for me to make a mistake. I kept running, but no matter where I went, it was always there." Silence fell over the group, the weight of Ethan's words pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. Michael exchanged a worried glance with Margaret, the implications of Ethan's story unsettling them both. "Do you think it's still out there?" Michael asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't answer, but the fear in his eyes said enough. Whatever he had experienced in those woods had left a deep, lingering terror, a terror that now infected the entire group. Margaret's hand tightened on Ethan's, her resolve clear in her expression. "We'll keep the fire going," she said firmly, "and we'll take turns keeping watch. We're stronger together, and we won't let anything harm us." Her words were meant to reassure, but the doubt lingered in the air like a shadow. The unknown threats in the forest, combined with the harsh elements and their dwindling supplies, were pushing the group to their limits. As they prepared to settle in for the night, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on them, something more than just the cold and the darkness. The forest, which had once seemed like a refuge, now felt like a trap, its secrets lurking just beyond the reach of the fire's light. With Margaret and Max by his side, Michael felt a flicker of hope, but he knew the dangers were real. The night held secrets, and whatever they were, they wouldn't stay hidden for long. The challenge wasn't just to survive the cold, but to outlast the darkness closing in around them. The fire crackled softly, casting long, flickering shadows across the forest floor. The group, huddled close to the flames, was quiet, each person lost in their thoughts. The night had grown colder, the air biting and sharp, but it wasn't just the cold that kept them on edge. It was Ethan's words, his tale of being watched, of shadows in the trees, that lingered in their minds, turning every rustle of leaves into a potential threat. Michael sat with his back to the fire, his eyes scanning the darkened woods around them. He felt a heaviness in his chest, a mix of exhaustion and fear that he couldn't shake. The forest, once merely a place of survival, had taken on an ominous presence, its darkness hiding dangers they couldn't see. Beside him, Margaret was alert, her posture tense as she kept watch. Max lay at her feet, his ears pricked up, his eyes darting to every sound. Michael could see the concern in her eyes, though she tried to keep it hidden. They were all on edge, and the tension in the group was palpable. Ethan, wrapped in a blanket, had finally drifted into a restless sleep, his body too exhausted to stay awake any longer. But even in sleep, his face was troubled, his brows furrowed as if still haunted by the memories of what he had endured. Margaret had made sure he was as comfortable as possible, but there was little they could do to ease the psychological wounds he carried. John, ever the sentinel, paced the edge of their makeshift camp, his eyes scanning the trees with suspicion. He had been silent since Ethan's story, but Michael could see the tension in his movements, the way his hand hovered near the makeshift weapon he carried. John was on edge, his usual bravado tempered by the fear that now gripped them all. "What do you think it is?" Michael asked Margaret quietly, his voice low to avoid waking the others. "Do you think Ethan was just imagining things? Or?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She kept her gaze on the forest, her eyes narrowing slightly as she considered his question. "I don't know," she admitted finally, "but I don't think we can afford to dismiss what he said. Out here, fear can play tricks on the mind, but it can also sharpen your instincts. Whatever Ethan experienced, it was real to him, and that means we need to take it seriously." Michael nodded, though the unease in his chest only grew. The idea of something, or someone, lurking in the darkness, watching them, waiting for them to let their guard down, was almost too much to bear. But he knew Margaret was right. They couldn't afford to be complacent. "I'll take the next watch," Michael offered, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "You should try to get some rest. You've been up all night." Margaret shook her head slightly. "I'm fine," she said, though there was a weariness in her voice that betrayed her fatigue. "We'll need all our strength if we're going to keep moving tomorrow. You should rest while you can." But Michael was reluctant to close his eyes, knowing that sleep would only bring more nightmares. "I don't think I could sleep even if I tried," he admitted. Margaret gave him a small, understanding smile. "I know the feeling, but we'll get through this, Michael. We just need to stay focused." Michael wished he could share her confidence, but the weight of everything they had been through, and everything that still lay ahead, pressed down on him like a suffocating blanket. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on them, something that wouldn't let them escape so easily. The fire crackled again, sending a shower of sparks into the air, and for a moment, Michael thought he saw something move in the darkness beyond the trees. He tensed, his breath catching in his throat as he strained to see. But whatever it was, if it had even been anything at all, was gone, swallowed by the night. Margaret noticed his reaction and placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We're safe for now," she said quietly. "As long as we stay together, we have a chance." Michael nodded, grateful for her steady presence. But the fear remained, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. The night was long, and the shadows seemed to grow darker with every passing hour. In the back of his mind, Michael knew that whatever was out there, whatever had driven Ethan to the brink, was still watching, waiting. The night was far from over, and they were all walking a fine line between survival and something far more dangerous. But for now, all they could do was keep the fire burning, hold on to each other, and hope that the dawn would bring some measure of safety. As the night stretched on, Michael's thoughts drifted to the morning light, praying it would come soon and reveal the path that would lead them out of the darkness. The first faint light of dawn began to creep through the trees, casting the forest in a muted gray. The fire had burned low, reduced to glowing embers, and the group stirred from their uneasy rest. The long night had taken its toll. Faces were drawn, eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. The warmth of the fire had kept the cold at bay, but it had done little to ease the deeper chill of uncertainty that had settled over them all. Margaret was the first to rise, moving quietly so as not to disturb the others. Max, ever vigilant, was at her side immediately, his nose nudging her hand as if sensing her weariness. She gave him a tired smile, grateful for his constant presence. They had made it through the night, but the day ahead promised no respite. Michael sat up slowly, his body aching from the cold and the hard ground. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep that clung to him like cobwebs. The fear that had plagued him during the night still lingered, but it was dulled by the light of morning. At least they could see now. Whatever dangers lurked in the forest would be harder to hide in the daylight. Ethan, still wrapped in his blanket, had managed to sleep through the rest of the night, though his sleep had been fitful. He stirred as the others began to move, blinking groggily as he tried to orient himself. The terror of the night before hadn't left him, but he seemed a little more grounded in the light of day. John, who had spent most of the night on watch, looked as if he hadn't slept at all. His face was shadowed with fatigue, and his eyes were bloodshot, but he remained on edge, his hand never far from his makeshift weapon. The unease that had settled over him the night before hadn't lifted with the dawn. Margaret glanced around at the group, assessing their condition. They were all exhausted, both physically and mentally, but they were alive. And that, she reminded herself, was something to be grateful for. "We need to keep moving," Margaret said quietly, her voice firm but gentle. "The fire won't last much longer, and we can't stay here. We need to find better shelter, somewhere we can rest and figure out our next move." Michael nodded in agreement, though the thought of leaving the relative safety of their camp filled him with dread. "Do you think we'll find anything out there?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "We have to try," Margaret replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Staying here isn't an option." Ethan, still bleary-eyed, looked up at her, his voice hesitant. "Do you think, whatever was out there last night, do you think it's still following us?" Margaret met his gaze, her expression serious. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we can't let fear paralyze us. We need to stay focused and keep moving." John, who had been silent up until now, grunted in agreement. "She's right. Whatever's out there, we're better off on the move than sitting here waiting for it." With that, the group began to gather their things, preparing to leave the camp. There wasn't much to take, just the blankets and what little food and water they had left. Margaret made sure Ethan was as warm as possible before they set off, keeping him close to her as they headed into the forest. The light of dawn, though weak, brought some comfort as they walked. The forest, though still foreboding, seemed less hostile in the daylight. But the unease remained, a constant undercurrent that kept them all on high alert. They moved cautiously, their footsteps crunching in the snow, the cold air biting at their faces. Margaret led the way, her senses sharp, scanning the trees for any signs of danger. Max stayed close by her side, his ears pricked, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. As they walked, the group fell into a tense silence, each person lost in their own thoughts. The night had left its mark on them, deepening the bonds of fear and uncertainty that tied them together. But it had also revealed something else, a resolve to survive, to push forward despite the odds. The forest stretched out before them, vast and unknown. But the light of day brought a flicker of hope. They had survived the night, and as long as they kept moving, there was a chance, however slim, that they might find a way out. Michael felt that hope, fragile as it was, taking root in his chest. The darkness hadn't defeated them. As long as they kept going, there was still a chance. And that was enough to keep him moving, one step at a time, into the cold light of dawn. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.